very much so.
Sorry, but there's an extra charge for that.
Yeah, nice benefit.
Okay, take it away.
All right. Happy Easter, everybody. Happy 100th anniversary of Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby as well. That I think was a couple of weeks ago. I just want to very briefly introduce the group and the journey that they've been on to come to the presentation they're going to give to you today. It started about 2 years ago at sophomore core English class, Bentley Upper School in Lafayette. And the teacher, Dr. Gabri, decided to read The Great Gatsby with fresh eyes. And when he did so, he made an astonishing discovery. Namely, James Gatz, alias J. Gatsby, is black, passing as white to recreate his identity and gain access to privileged society. Very radical discovery to make, and again, on the close to the 100th anniversary. Now, it is important to understand that passing is a very common phenomena in the early 20th century. What culture describes as black is not always something that's visible to the eye in the subject. We know that you can have persons of mixed lineage that can look entirely white or entirely black, and even more so if they put any effort into looking that way. And so a lot of people were passing early 20th century. Baseball players, politicians, actors, singers, Jelly Roll Morton, tremendous amount of people. So it was quite the phenomena at the time. So Gabri floats this theory before his class. They're intrigued, and 6 students in particular decide they want to throw themselves into this project. And so they do. They go deep into formulating the discovery that they've made. They do a lot of intertextual research, and they prepare a paper for publication and a conference presentation. The paper that resulted is going to be published in ELH, English Literary History, coming up, summertime?
I believe in 2026. But it's available now in a public repository, and I think Eric has a link to it in the advertisement for this event. So you can actually read it ahead of time before it's edited, and all the good stuff is taken out by the journal.
Well, and ELH is the highest possible placement. It's the most prestigious placement of any periodical in the humanities, but better than MLA. So it's an incredible landing for this article. Now, they also did a conference presentation. That was also accepted, and that was accepted for last May at the ALA, American Language Association, in Chicago. So Dr. Gabri, the 6 students, 3 of whom are here, Josh, Theo, Mimi, went to Chicago to give this presentation. And you have to understand, the audience at this time is the F. Scott Fitzgerald Society. So we're talking about the greatest Fitzgerald scholars on the planet are in the room. And the first shock that they receive is when 6 students walk in to present the argument. Because students do not speak at the ALA. I don't think it's ever happened before. It wasn't exactly on the bill. Gabri kind of smuggled them in, so to speak. And there they are standing at the front of the room getting ready to school the room of Fitzgerald scholars.
We were able to pass. They look just old enough to pass.
Yeah. Well, the second shock was when they dropped the thesis, because nobody knew that was coming. And they pretty much led with it. Here's the story. Gatsby's black. And when they said that, the entire room in concert went, oh! And the moderator involuntarily just went, oh my God. And from that point, they just very coolly delivered the news, one after another, unassailable argument, all of the evidence in tow. And you can imagine the shock it had in that room, because what they're basically doing is subverting and undermining the entire career's work of almost everybody in the room. And the backlash to Black Gatsby has always been intense. And it didn't begin with this group. It began with Carlisle Thompson some 20 years ago, put forth this discovery. And of course, he was vituperatively attacked. And he has since gotten wind of this group. And in fact, they're joining forces tomorrow night when they present at Bentley Upper School. Carlisle Thompson will be zoomed in, so he will be part of the meeting and will be able to enjoy this validation of his work. So every novel is a crime scene, right? It's filled with scattered clues and enigmas and riddles, and they have to be unraveled. They have to be interpreted to be understood. And so, here to give us the solution to The Great Gatsby, Dr. Gabri.
Well, thank you. That was quite the introduction. I kind of was imagining doing a bit of a reading of the novel because I think people who've read it or think they know it, they need to re-familiarize themselves with the novel. It's easy to sort of skip around a lot of important details that are meaningful in hindsight. So what we've selected some passages, and we're each going to be talking about some of these passages. And we're going to be presenting basically the findings of Carlisle Van Thompson. He was the scholar who originally came up with the passing thesis of Gatsby, and this was over 20 years ago in a book called The Tragic Black Buck. Now, Van Thompson's expertise was in passing literature. That's what he studied. African-American literature where characters are passing all the time. So he was not a Fitzgerald scholar per se, but when he came to Fitzgerald, what he saw were the same kinds of tropes and things that black writers were using to indicate characters were passing were being used in The Great Gatsby to indicate that he might be passing, basically Fitzgerald borrowing those tropes and using in his novel. The first thing to note here is I want to just read the opening of the novel because it's important. One thing people forget is Nick Carraway is the narrator of this novel, but he's not just a narrator. He claims he's the author also, which is kind of strange. Narrator and author of The Great Gatsby. He says he wrote the book. And it's written as a kind of memoir about his life during that period while he was in New York. And Gatsby was one of these enigmatic characters that he met that he wants to write about. So he's writing about himself, his own life, while he's writing about Gatsby too. But he begins the novel this way. He says, in my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way, whatever that's supposed to mean. I guess they only understand the code in which they talk to each other. And I understood that he meant a great deal more than that. What is the great deal? What you're getting right away is Nick is telling us something, and at the same time, he's withholding something. So, and this is a theme that runs throughout Gatsby. Every time he tells us something, you always get the feeling also that there's something he's leaving out. And so this becomes important. But the question I would ask Nick if I was here is, what kind of advantages is your dad talking about? Are we talking about economic advantages or other kinds of advantages? What kind of advantages have people had that haven't had that you should not judge them on? And because Gatsby's often read as a novel about class, the assumption is you shouldn't judge people who are born of a lower class than you and then do whatever it takes to rise up. And that's the advantage that they assumed, or disadvantage they assumed the character Gatsby had in his life, that he was born poor to poor parents, and he did whatever it took to try to rise in class. But there are other kinds of disadvantages in the world. One of them, in the 1920s especially, is if you're born black. That would be considered a kind of disadvantage compared to if you are born white and have a certain kind of privilege in society. So right away, this raises a whole host of questions, this opening. And now we want to sort of highlight, Mimi's, I'm not going to go through the whole passage. We want to highlight how Fitzgerald himself draws attention to the problem of race in the novel from the very beginning, from the very first chapter. Because Nick Carraway is now going to roll back time and tell us about his experience in New York when he met Gatsby. But before he ever meets Gatsby, he first interacts with his cousin, Daisy Buchanan, and her husband, Tom Buchanan. And these two become very important characters in the novel. Mimi, I'm going to sit over here.
So this passage from it's a little tall.
I can hold it for you.
I can hold it.
You got it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So this passage from the beginning of the book starts with Nick saying, "You make me feel uncivilized, Daisy. Can't you talk about crops or something?" And it gives way to Tom Buchanan, who's Daisy's husband, talking about the book The Rise of the Colored Empires by Goddard, which is an actual book that was published in the 1920s, which kind of incentivized this scientific racist fear about the idea that, well, to quote Tom Buchanan, the idea is if we don't look out, the white race will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. It's it's been proven. And we are going to talk about something at the end of the talk that relates to this, but specifically in this first chapter, there is a lot of imagery related to boats. So the idea of utterly submerged. Like, I think when we talk about the idea of the white race going out today, as some eugenics talk about it, we see the idea of like breeding out, or like the gene is like coming out in like a biological term. Not a lot of people describe this as the idea of submersion. So if you keep that in mind for the book that we will reference at the end of the talk, there is a lot to do with boats and water. And also, additionally, as Daisy says, Tom's getting very profound. Profound also relates to water, also relates to deepness, and then he reads deep books. I don't know if we could say that the Colored Empires is deep. I would say the opposite, but deepness also relates to profoundness, which also relates to water. So in this passage, which is echoed by a passage later in the chapter about Daisy's white girlhood, where she emphasizes our white girlhood, we pass together there, our beautiful white, and then gets cut off. This passage really establishes that race is a big part of the Great Gatsby, and it would be confusing to overlook this if we see that it's only a class-conscious book, because if in the first chapter we're already seeing a lot of reference to eugenics and racism and the idea of nativism as well, it's like finding a really, really big clue and then kind of leaving it discarded. And if you only read it as the idea of class passing, then you have this whole mantra of evidence that doesn't make sense and feels too refined to be discarded.
Well, yeah, the question is, do great writers just put in things like this, themes like this, and then discard them? Or are they meant to set up something that's supposed to come afterwards? And to think that Fitzgerald's a great writer and he would just sort of do this as kind of ambiance to tell us, well, there were racist people in the 1920s. Well, thanks for letting us know. There's got to be more to this. And, of course, the story becomes rich with irony if the man who's pursuing his wife happens to be a black man. And then this theme of miscegenation really starts to resonate and take on new dimensions. But if you just leave it as a kind of detail that he just threw in there to give us a flavor of what people were thinking back then, it doesn't seem, I mean, the way I teach reading to these kids, like everything is a clue to some, and it's a solution to a puzzle. And so this is one of the important pieces that Van Thompson points out in his reading of Gatsby, in addition to Daisy's white girlhood, which is important. Daisy is from, does she say, Louisville, Kentucky, which is the home of Jim Crow in this period, and segregation. So that's an important detail. And the color white keeps coming up throughout Gatsby. And Fitzgerald is working with this color. You could see that. In 1920, Fitzgerald wrote a story called Bernice Bobs Her Hair. And it's about a young woman and teenager who's trying to fit in with other teenagers of the time who happens to have some Indian blood in her. And so it's also a kind of story about passing. And in that story, Fitzgerald is working with the color red in relation to how Native Americans are described and their skin. So he's interested in these colors in relation to skin color, and he's working with them, not just here, but in his other works too. The theme of Myrtle Wilson. Did anyone want to talk about that, or should we? Because so I want to. What I want to do is tell the audience about the fact that passing, the idea that characters are passing in this novel is highlighted because there's not one form of passing. Dr. Walker talked about racial passing. That's what we've been talking about. But a lot of people have read this is a novel about class passing. Characters who are born a lower class and then they try to pass as higher class characters by accumulating wealth or dating men who are rich and pretending they're part of that elite culture like Myrtle Wilson tries to do. Should I read this? Did anyone want to take this one, or I could take this? Okay, so I'll take Myrtle Wilson. So in chapter 1, we get the Buchanans, we meet them. Now in chapter 2, we meet Tom Buchanan's girlfriend, Myrtle Wilson, who is trying to, she's married, she's a married woman, but by dating this rich man from old money, she's trying to sort of move up in station. And Nick is not very kind to her, and we'll talk about why in a bit. But this is how Nick describes Mrs. Wilson in her apartment that she shares with, or the apartment that Tom Buchanan has rented for her. Mrs. Wilson had changed her costume some time before and was now attired in an elaborate afternoon dress of cream-colored chiffon, which gave out a continual rustle as she swept about the room. With the influence of the dress, her personality had also undergone a change. The intense vitality that had been so remarkable in the garage was converted into impressive hauteur. Her laughter, her gestures, her assertions became more violently affected moment by moment, and as she expanded, the room grew smaller around her until she seemed to be revolving on a noisy, creaking pivot through the smoky air. So Nick sort of characterized her as an actress, and these costume changes, he calls them, that she's putting on, she's trying to imitate upper-class rich people who have different outfits on different times of the day. But again, he's not very, very, very kind to her in her attempt to pass as a rich person, as an affluent person. So there are different kinds of passing in this novel, and this is one of them. Gatsby later, in the 3rd chapter, is doing the same thing, but Nick is a lot more sympathetic to Gatsby's attempts at class passing than he is to Myrtle's. He's a bit of a misogynist, and we'll discuss why coming up here.
All right, now I want to talk about another character who we see as kind of very obviously passing, and that's the character of Nick in the novel, the narrator. And this is a reading, I've talked with my parents that they did not have it all growing up and reading this book in their high school, but I think it's become pretty prevalent in high schools around the country as people talk about this book. Especially, it felt very obvious when reading through The Great Gatsby for the first time. And this is that Nick could be a gay man passing as straight. And we're given one passage especially that really, that I feel like very directly relates to that. And it's right after the party that's at Myrtle's house. Throughout the whole party, he's kind of interacting with this man, Mr. McKee. And there's also an earlier passage where Mr. McKee has a piece of shaving cream just on his upper lip. And Nick goes and wipes it off of him with kind of no explanation given for that. And then after, when they're leaving the party, we're given this very interesting passage. So then Mr. McKee turned and continued on out the door. Taking my hat from the chandelier, I followed. Come to lunch someday, he suggested, as we groaned down in the elevator. Where? Anywhere. Keep your hands off the lever, snapped the elevator boy. I beg your pardon, said Mr. McKee with dignity. I didn't know I was touching it. All right, I agreed. I'd be glad to. So firstly, we see very obviously that Nick is kind of agreeing to this little date, it seems like, with Mr. McKee. But even further than that, I think this can be read as a pretty obvious innuendo. I don't want to get into that too much. But I think this could be seen as kind of a sexual innuendo about them. And then it continues on kind of past the point of innuendo because we're given this just kind of this ellipsis, and then Nick's point of view switches to, I was standing beside his bed, and he was sitting up between the sheets, clad in his underwear, with a great portfolio in his hands. So I don't know if you can get any more straightforward than that, really. That he's now in Mr. McKee's house, in his bedroom with him, basically naked in the bed. I think we're basically given that this is a very obvious moment of this kind of passing of Nick's sexuality. I mean, throughout the book, this isn't really acknowledged beyond his point of view. And I think this is also kind of an affirmation of how much of an unreliable narrator, that Nick is. I mean, we are never told anything explicitly by him, right? We're told that he knows. What's that quote? That he knows more.
He knows more than he tells, but tells less than he knows.
Yeah.
So he knows more than he tells, but his language tells more, less than he knows. And that becomes an important clue in terms of the fact that not only is he concealing things, but maybe there's a way in which Fitzgerald can tell us things that Nick isn't telling us. And then that'll get into what we want to sort of bring to the table, which is Fitzgerald can clue us into what Nick isn't telling us, especially in relation to the question of race, through intertextuality with Conrad. So by referencing Conrad's novel, he's going to tell us about Gatsby. We'll get into that. So now we've already identified at least two forms of passing. We have class passing, we have sexual passing, and now we're going to get into a little bit about the racial passing in Gatsby. And just to talk about the clues within the novel that show that Gatsby's passing. And this is what Van Thompson found. And you want to jump in and talk about some of this, Jay?
Okay, so we're gonna kind of just start talking more about like the clues on racial passing. Kind of taking Dr. Walker's word earlier. I really do agree when he says that the novel's like a crime scene. There's hints and clues left everywhere, and we try to kind of want to just weed out those clues and kind of explicate on what we found and how they can relate to racial passing. So the first passage I'm gonna read is from earlier in the book when Nick kind of settles into his new house and he looks around his neighbors, one of which is Gatsby, and this is how he describes it. The one on my right was a colossal affair by any standard. It was a factual imitation of some Hôtel de Ville in Normandy with a tower on one side, spanking new under a thin beard of raw ivy, and a marble swimming pool, and more than 40 acres of lawn and garden. It was Gatsby's mansion. So specifically in this passage, we want to highlight 40 acres of lawn and garden. We think this may be a reference to 40 acres and a mule, which is a phrase that came up during the Civil War when a Union general promised that newly freed enslaved peoples would receive 40 acres and a mule as a means of reparation for their time as slaves. And so that reference to slavery, again, that being related to the African American identity, we found that was an odd hint to kind of drop. Why exactly 40?
It's quite a number that he just picks out of thin air, right? I mean, that's what Van Tom's like. Of all the numbers in the world, I'm just going to pick that one, 40, which such resonance in the history of this country. I'm writing about America.
And so, yeah, kind of, we don't think this is just a random number. We think it is a reference specifically to that promise made by the Union General. And so that could be a hint to Gatsby's racial passing, his true identity as possibly African American.
Do you want to do the hair and skin?
Another hint we picked up was kind of on Gatsby's more physical features. I'll just start off with the quote and then I can explain it a bit. My eyes fell on Gatsby, standing alone on the marble steps and looking down from one group to another with approving eyes. His tanned skin was drawn attractively tight on his face, and his short hair looked as though it were trimmed every day. So specifically pointing out tan skin or short hair that was trimmed every day, like physical attributes commonly attributed to African Americans, specifically in the Jazz Age. If you can look up photos back then of African American males during that time period, you can see some of these features. Like,
well, especially if you're trying to pass and you don't want your curls to come out, so you're cropping your hair, you're keeping it short to make sure no one notices. Fitzgerald's this is not a very long novel. It's basically a novella. So every word is chosen carefully. Every description you have to really think he considered. And so the fact that he describes Gatsby as tan, and then later with a brown body, those are the only descriptions we get of Gatsby's skin color.
There's like just a continued reference to skin color, and we'll be covering that a slight bit more later on. And if we put this quote in contrast with a later quote we'll talk about, specifically with Daisy, then it becomes more than just a coincidence at that point.
And continuing with color, one of the most famous symbols in the story is the car, Gatsby's car, which ends up causing the car wreck and everything that goes with it. But what about the color of that car? According to Van Thompson, the color is yellow. That's a racial marker for him because black people were light-skinned during that time were called high yellow. And this yellow is significant then in terms of Gatsby's passing, if the car sort of is a displacement of his passing. So the car represents what he's doing. He is the high yellow black character who's trying to pass. And there are different ways in which this car comes back in the story. Later, for example, when this same car kills Murder Wilson and they're trying to identify the car, if you read the novel, you notice the person who identifies Gatsby's car is a black man. Is a pale black man who identifies him. Now, what Van Thompson says about this is that during those days, passing was such a phenomenon, and white people were so worried about racial infiltrators into their restaurants, into their clubs, into the place they liked to hang out, that they would hire black people to stand outside and catch these racial infiltrators and spot them. And so the fact that it's a black man who spots Gatsby's yellow car also becomes kind of significant in that context. The other thing we want to mention, which highlight, is Gatsby went to war. He was a part of World War I, and he received a medal from Montenegro. Anyone want to talk about the Montenegro medal? It's mentioned 7 times. Yeah, I'm trying to keep because I thought Montenegro, it's Black Mountain. And Van Thompson makes a big deal out of the fact that the one country that gives him a medal is named Black Mountain. And it was an up-and-coming country. It was a kind of an underdog of a country. So this also represents Gatsby's kind of underdog status as he tries to achieve the American dream in this country. And then, of course, there's a famous Queensboro Bridge episode where everyone talks about it. There's Gatsby's car going to Manhattan, going to New York, and what Fitzgerald describes is this amazing scene where the city sort of appears, and it represents all the promise, hope of America. There it is. And on one side of Gatsby's cars, you have Eastern European immigrants, and they're basically a group of cars that are in a funeral procession. So here are people who came from Eastern Europe for the American dream, and all they found was death. So there's on that side. And then on the other side of Gatsby's car are what he describes as 2 modish Negroes and a black woman with them, as there are 3 modish Negroes. Let's see if this quote is here. I think I have it. All right, let me read it because it's beautiful. Over the great bridge, with the sunlight through the girders making a constant flicker upon the moving cars, with the city rising up across the river in white heaps and sugar lumps, all built with a wish out of non-olfactory money. The city seen from the Queensboro Bridge is always the city seen for the first time, in its first wild promise of all the mystery and the beauty of the world. A dead man passed us in a hearse heaped with blooms, followed by 2 carriages with drawn blinds, and by more cheerful carriages for friends. The friends looked at us with the tragic eyes and short upper lips of southeastern Europe, and I was glad that the sight of Gatsby's splendid car was included in the somber holiday. What a guy Nick is, huh? As we crossed Blackwell's Island, a limousine passed us, driven by a white chauffeur. In which sat 3 modish Negroes, 2 bucks and a girl. I laughed aloud as the yolks of their eyeballs rolled towards us in haughty rivalry. Anything can happen now that we've slid over this bridge, I thought. Anything at all. Even Gatsby could happen without any particular wonder. And so that becomes an important moment for Van Thompson, situating Gatsby's car, because you have to visualize it. What is Fitzgerald telling us about Gatsby? If he's situated between these Eastern Europeans and then the limousine with the black passengers. Is Gatsby himself something in between these characters? Is that why he's physically situated in between them? Is he biracial? So that becomes an important moment. What also is interesting is Nick displays his own bit of racism in this scene. As much as he criticizes Tom Buchanan for being a racist and nibbling on stale ideas, he himself exhibits racism. But the question is, why? Why is he doing that here? It's an interesting one.
I think it's also important to think about how,
Give him the mic.
how this is I mean, if we're accepting Van Thompson's thesis and Nick is then like kind of going along with Gatsby's attempts to pass in white American society, then this is the moment revealing kind of how Nick would be talking about him if he weren't passing. I think it shows like the necessity kind of Gatsby's actions, right? That he absolutely would not be seen as human if he were just going about his life and trying to display his wealth as a Black American here in 1920.
Well, I think also if we think about the movie Get Out, which is kind of an absurdist movie to compare to this, but the idea that microaggressions can sometimes be the most damaging and upsetting to marginalized people, I think goes here too, is that yes, you can say that you're an ally, you can say that you're defending a friend, but in the end, it is a lot of the people that are closest to marginalized people and Black people that end up committing these microaggressions that hurt them the most. So I think that even if he could be going along with Gatsby's passing, it also could just be a thing that happens a lot, that continues to happen in our society today, that Fitzgerald picks up on and kind of can have this kind of double literary meaning, but is also just something that happens.
I'm just going to mention a couple of things before we go. Was there anything before we jump into the Plaza Hotel scene, which is really important for our reading of the novel, because we haven't even talked about what we bringing to the table. Everything here is what Van Thompson said, basically, but it's important to establish that because there's enough in the novel itself to prove that this is a passing narrative. We just added on to it. So Daisy's there's a scene in which Daisy's described kissing Gatsby. And very noticeably, Nick says his heart beat faster. This is the first kiss they ever had, faster as Daisy's white face came up to his own. So Fitzgerald makes a point of describing Daisy's face as white, coming up and kissing Gatsby's. And then later in the novel, Fitzgerald says this. He says he took what he could get, meaning Gatsby, ravenously and unscrupulously. Eventually, he took Daisy one still October night, meaning they made love, took her because he had no real right to touch her hand. Now, for 100 years, scholars have just read this as meaning, well, he felt he had no right to touch her hand because he comes from a lower class and he feels inferior to her. But the fact that Daisy's from Louisville, Kentucky, and there are Jim Crow laws forbidding a Black person to touch the hands of a white woman, because if he did, they would consider rape, and literally they have no right to do it, then this becomes a legal right as much as anything that Gatsby felt psychologically. So again, Fitzgerald's very cleverly playing with language here. Sure, you can interpret right as him feeling, oh, I have no right because she's so rich and poor, but he could also be referencing the legal right. He really couldn't touch her hand because of rape. Okay, we want to jump to the all-important Plaza Hotel scene. This is where everything comes to a head for Gatsby, and he's exposed by Tom Buchanan.
I will start with this quote from Tom. I suppose the latest thing is to sit back and let Mr. Nobody from Nowhere make love to your wife. Well, if that's the idea, you can count me out. Nowadays, people begin by sneering at family life and family institutions, and next they'll throw everything overboard and have intermarriage between Black and white. Flushed with his impassioned gibberish, he saw himself standing alone at the last barrier of civilization. We're all white here, murmured Jordan. So notice how, if we read this from a class standpoint, it goes very quickly from being about family life and institutions into miscegenation. And so, yes, Tom is a racist, but this is put here very intentionally. And also the quote from Jordan. And we read a lot of the former drafts of The Great Gatsby, and there is significant change and take out from this scene relating to race and racism. So to connect to Conrad's novel, we already here see, well, they'll throw everything overboard, which is literally a reference to what happens in Conrad's novel. And also before that, Daisy says, you're causing a row. You row a boat, you know? So this Mr. Nobody from Nowhere can possibly relate, again, to class and like class consciousness, but really if we read it with the idea of miscegenation, the intermarriage between black and white people, we're having that Tom Buchanan is exposing Gatsby for being black, but everybody else in the room, including Jordan, is like, wait, but we're white. And so I think one of the biggest clues that Fitzgerald has left us is Jordan saying we're all white here, because otherwise, if you just leave Tom Buchanan to say all this stuff, there doesn't seem to be connection about what's happening in the room, because he's already been shown to be super racist. But by Jordan saying that we're all white here, which could possibly throw you off if you want to believe that Jordan knows everything about what's happening, it does hint that what Tom is saying applies to the room more specifically than what we think.
Well, earlier in the novel, Nick establishes that Jordan's a liar. First of all, she's cheated in golf, which is a huge deal, and he calls her an incurable liar. So the one character who says this, we can't trust. Nick, we can't trust because he's already unreliable. Ironically, the only person we can trust is Tom Buchanan because he's an honest liar. He can't even hide his affair with Myrtle Wilson. He's just a bull in a china shop. So when he says something, you could kind of take him literally. There is no subterfuge with him. And that's one of the kind of rich ironies in this scene. The other one is that Tom is not worried about the fact, he's not worried about the days he's cheating on him. He's more worried about who she's cheating with. If the guy was a rich millionaire like him and white and old money, maybe we could overlook it. But this guy, I suspect him of not being white. That's the problem. And that's what the real issue is. And then that's another irony here. Now, this is the scene that really resonates in the Conrad novel. And this is where our contribution sort of comes in. What we found was Fitzgerald here is referencing Conrad. Now, I don't know how many of you have read Conrad's novel, The N-Word of the Narcissus. I'm going to refer to it euphemistically, The N-Word of the Narcissus. Later, it was renamed Children of the Sea, and then Conrad changed it back again to The N-Word of the Narcissus. It's about a character named James Waite, who's a black sailor at sea, and he suffers through extreme racism by the crew on that ship, who call him the N-word throughout that narrative. James Waite is himself described by Conrad as an imposter because he's constantly playing games. He's acting, he's a malingerer. So people don't know if he's actually sick or pretending to be sick to get out of work. And are trying to figure out, is he really dying or is he just acting like he's dying so he doesn't have to do work? And he keeps playing this game with the crew until he finally dies. And when he dies, the character, the antagonist who puts the final nail in James Waite's coffin is a racist character who very much resembles Buchanan. His name is Duncan. And in that scene, when he calls out James Waite's lights, is very reminiscent of this, because as James Waite is dying, he's lying on his deathbed, he says, you know what, I think I'm going to live. I'm not going to die. I have time left. And when I live, the ship is going to land in London, and I'm going to get together with this Canton Street girl, who might be a prostitute, who might not. He's going to get together with her. Okay, so what about that? Well, James Waite says this, not only am I going to get together, but this girl loves me, a black man, because I'm nice to women. And she told me that she would chuck any rich person, any rich white person, and take me over them because I'm so nice to women. And when Duncan hears this, he's enraged. He can't believe it. He's scandalized. What? A white woman would choose you over white men who are affluent? Are you kidding me? And he verbally assaults James Waite. And do you know what he calls him? You're nobody. You're nobody at all. You're nothing. And he keeps going at him like this. And he goes at him, it's to such an extent that James Waite, it destroys him. He loses all hope of holding on to life because Duncan reminds him that he's nothingness. And in fact, he says, you're going to die, and you know what we're going to do with you? We're going to throw you overboard. And in fact, if I wasn't drunk right now, I'd throw you overboard now. And so there's this weird overboard that we get here. There's Duncan calling him a nobody. And then Conrad describes Duncan in this way. Do you remember the line here? It says, flushed with his impassioned gibberish, he saw himself standing alone on the last barrier of civilization. That's Nick's description of Buchanan, standing there defending his Nordic race against anyone, and he's the last man standing. Well, Duncan, there's a similar line in Conrad. It says, his passionate sense of his own importance ran away with the last remnant of caution. So there's a parallel between the last barrier of civilization and the last remnant of caution. Fitzgerald is drawing attention to the fact that that his Tom Buchanan is based on Conrad's character, and his Jay Gatsby, whose name is James Gatz, he changed it to Jay Gatsby, his James Gatz. James Gatz is based on the character James Waite, the black sailor in Conrad's novel.
And I think even beyond looking at these individual lines, I feel like reading through these books, the plots just have such parallels. I mean, it's these characters who they're liars, right? They're totally given as liars, or that their lives are fake in some way, and that they're just these like sites of artifice, and they're totally surrounded by all of these characters who are like instantly like enamored with them. I mean, James Waite is on the boat, and obviously he's very hated by this white crew, but they also become just kind of completely obsessed with him. And I think the same can be said of Gatsby. And just, I don't know, this moment and then the moment with Donkin are so much like they're being taken down in the exact same way, and like their artifice is being stripped away, and it's revealed that they're nobody.
Both men die waiting, right? James Waite dies waiting for his reunion with the Canton Street girl. He dies waiting on a boat floating on water. And Jay Gatsby dies waiting for a phone call from Daisy. And he dies in his swimming pool floating on a mattress before as he's shot by George Wilson. So Fitzgerald creates all these different parallels. You have to read the paper. There are many more. I mean, anybody would be able to spot them instantly. But apparently Fitzgerald scholars have had a hard time spotting it for 100 years. It's just kind of, I don't know. You'll have to ask them why. I'm not going to say anything more about that. Since this being recorded, they might see me and get mad at me. You wanted the last part of this novel in Fitzgerald, super important. Nick does something that kind of tells us what's going on.
Yeah. Now, this is a moment that takes place directly after Gatsby's funeral. I will say, as a side note, that kind of interestingly, Gatsby's funeral and James Waite's funeral are held at the same time of day.
5
we thought was
o'clock.
interesting. But right after the funeral, Nick goes back to Gatsby's home, and he sees this. On the white steps, an obscene word, scrawled by some boy with a piece of brick, stood out clearly in the moonlight, and I erased it, drawing my shoe raspingly along the stone. So I think this is a moment that I feel like we can find no explanation for if we aren't looking at this book through a lens of race. But I think when we are looking at this book as a book that is largely about race, it becomes immediately clear that this word would be the N-word. I think that's especially interesting given our reading that this is a novel that was titled The N-Word of the Narcissus, right?
Conrad's novel.
Yeah, Conrad's novel, The N-Word of the Narcissus. And that this novel, upon being published, its name was changed in America, but Conrad, very importantly, insisted that it would be changed back to the N-word. He thought it was so important that be at the face of it, that dehumanization was at the face of it. But we can...
Yeah, go on.
We can just see that in this moment, this is just such an obvious moment, kind of continuing talking about Nick as an unreliable narrator. I mean, he's literally erasing the narrative around Gatsby. He's deciding what the words will be around Gatsby, and he's erasing the N-word there. And then also, I think in the larger interpretation of the two novels, we can see kind of by erasing the N-word and by helping Gatsby pass, Nick is kind of erasing the prejudice that exists around Gatsby. But just because of the white society around him, the only way for him to be completely erasing that prejudice is also to be completely erasing Gatsby's race and his identity and not being able to show it at all.
Yeah,
I was going to say also, I'm taking a Toni Morrison class right now, and I think that if we are to kind of think about what would this obscene word be in terms of like class, I think that we see a lot of the times that language has a lot more weight when it comes to racism than it does to class, because there's a very concrete thing that you can do with class and you can take away money. But how do you add racism? How do you take away racism? A lot of that has to do with language and how we utilize language. And especially as Toni Morrison kind of continues and really brought to light this tradition of language. I think we can see that here a lot in the intentionality that Fitzgerald adds that seems really strange when we read it through a lens of class. That if we read it through a lens of passing and of blackness, this intentionality of language and this obscene word written on the steps that is erased, and the idea of erasure of race, of passing, is so much more integral to the black experience and to the marginalized experience than to the class experience.
And it's a rewriting of history. It's a whitewashing of history, and Fitzgerald's very conscious of that. It comes at the end of the novel. It's almost like he wants to tell us that's what Nick has been doing throughout. But I'm going to show you at the end what's been going on throughout this thing, which is this kind of erasure and whitewashing. And what makes this significant in relation to Conrad is in Conrad's novel, James Waite, the men only start calling him the N-word once he's made visible in that novel. Before they see him, when he first appears in that novel and it's dark and no one knows who he is, they kind of treat him like a pro. Who is this guy? And then the light shines on his face, and then the racism begins. And so Fitzgerald's solution to kind of novelizing blackness for a white audience in terms of keeping the racism out is he makes the character invisible. And therefore, you can't be racist towards something you can't see, a black person you can't see.
I will also say in this moment that Dr. Gabri is referring to, this is, I believe, the first scene of the N-word of the Narcissus.
Yeah.
In this moment, it's somebody who works in the ship reading off the registrar of each of the sailors' names, and he gets to the end of the list, and there's a name that's literally smudged out, kind of in the exact same way that this word here at the very end of Fitzgerald's novel is sponged out. Waite's name is just kind of erased, and then Waite clarifies it by shouting, "Wait," out of the darkness.
Yeah, wait. Yeah, so that's kind of most of what we have for you, but if you have questions, we'll take them. Any questions from the audience, including you, Eric? We'll take a question from you too. Hi.
I do have a question. I'm wondering, so this book came out in the 1920s. When it came out, do you think people knew and we have just forgotten in the 100 years? Or do you think it was never known that this was about?
Well, this is an interesting question because I found a couple of, this novel was, Fitzgerald kept trying to sell it again and again. It was condensed for the Saturday Post or the Sunday Post. It was put in newspaper format, and it was completely chopped up and Baudelarized and everything. But in those renditions, there are images that accompany the text. And in some of those images, Gatsby is very dark, especially in relation to Daisy. He almost looks like Billy D. Williams from the Star Wars movies. And you're thinking, and this was published in 1937 before Fitzgerald died. He would have seen it. And you're thinking, somebody read this novel and knew something. The people who are closer to it may have picked up on it. And as time has gone on and it's become a classic because it wasn't then, people have actually stopped reading it maybe the way they would have read it then. Now, we do think that Nella Larson read Gatsby as a passing narrative, which becomes important. There are a couple of essays that have been written arguing that basically this is her version of Gatsby. And the main character, Claire Kendry, in there, who's passing, is her Gatsby. And he turns into a woman who's trying to pass. There are two really important essays about that. So if she read Gatsby as a passing narrative, that's a huge clue that it could have been a passing narrative. And there are references, allusions. Just like she's alluding to Fitzgerald, Fitzgerald himself is making allusions to Conrad's novel. And these novels are all in conversation with each other, and that's how they need to be read in order to make a full sense out of them.
I will say that we can see very obviously in 1920s America that this was not the majority reading of the book. And we see that acknowledged kind of by Fitzgerald in one of the later editions, right? In the preface to one of the later editions, he says basically, nobody is reading my book correctly, nobody is interpreting it correctly.
He says that in an interview somewhere, and in the 1934 preface, he basically makes a confession saying, by the way, when I was reading The Great Gatsby, I was reading this novel, Conrad's novel. Hint, hint. he references the preface to that novel to be accurate, but who reads a preface of the novel and not the novel itself? I mean, give me a break. So he references this novel by name, and it's just the first two words, and it's an incredible moment in that introduction because basically, at least according to my reading, he's undoing what Nick Carraway does in The White Steps. What Nick Carraway erases the N-word, and he puts it back into the novel by writing it in the preface of his book.
I'll also say that this game of kind of different authors referencing each other and rewriting each other's novels was very much present, and it's kind of acknowledged by Fitzgerald. I'm pretty sure, right? Fitzgerald in this letter to Hemingway.
Where he says, you're basically
yeah.
stealing my Gatsby. Your character, Manuel
exactly.
Garcia, is based on my Gatsby. I know, So, yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, yes.
Thank you for this great contribution. You
Oh,
made. Wonderful. When you made the presentation to the conference,
mhm.
I can't believe the reaction wasn't hostile a lot because, as was mentioned, you were threatening
The status quo.
people
I,
and
I,
what they've done.
Yeah, I got to say they were very generous. Everyone there was super generous. They were so thrilled to see high school students. Everyone there was welcoming and generous. The reactions that you saw were mostly the hostility, were more muted. You had to kind of read in the silence, the hostility, not so much in what was said, but what wasn't said. So, and maybe some people getting a little red in the face.
Did you get positive remarks from the
Yes, we did get some positive remarks.
And there was pushback here at the conference too, and there were later speakers who tried to sort of marginalize the argument presentation. But it was muted, right?
Yeah.
Everyone was on their best behavior.
how many people were there?
Oh, it was a room, I would say 40 to 50 people. The room was packed. Yeah.
Question for the students. What new things did you learn about the act of scholarship and engaging in the process of writing an essay like this? Like, has it shifted the way that you thought about writing or reading or being a scholar?
To just start it off, I think this experience alone has influenced me a lot in what I want to do, like in college. Research, I think now is something I hold very close to me, and I've pursued like other research things outside of this, and I still want to continue more research when I go into college. So I think it's a really special thing, just because you're able to contribute something to scholarship, you're able to add new meaning to things, and adds depth to works. But just specifically for this, it's shown us that, we can't just limit ourselves to like a curriculum we may have been given, and we don't have to limit ourselves to what people have been telling us. We can continue just looking out towards things people may tell you it's preposterous, it's too radical. But even so, if you have the right evidence, if you do the research, I think this opportunity, especially this, has shown a lot that a lot can be done in literature, and a lot can be discovered, and there's always more work to be done.
I think also, because I did a class with Dr. Gray after this, it was a junior year seminar. I thought it was really funny that Dr. Gray would always ask us questions that he didn't have answers to, and I was like, oh my God, he's farming children. Like, this is why he doesn't work at a college, because he can get our work for free. But but I think that it is honestly a valid pursuit, and I think it's opened me up to the idea that, like, as an artist, I mostly do visual art, but I do write. You shouldn't limit yourself to the only interpretation that you think, because, I mean, in this, like, the interpretation that Fitzgerald wanted, like, wasn't even written. But I think that if you really turn to people who aren't necessarily professionals at what they're doing, like high school students, even high school students who do not care about literature, like, they actually have a lot of interesting things to say because they don't care, because they don't know what's happening. And I think that that's kind of the issue, which is not to say that I don't care, But I have heard some interesting opinions from my classmates who I know don't care. So that's what I'm saying, you know? Props to them. But I think that kind of relates to the conference where people were so stuck in their own opinion. And that's because if you get so good at something, if you are just in one area, if you are just a Fitzgerald scholar, you are in a pit. You cannot dig yourself out of it. And that relates to this novel in that intersectionality is incredibly important. And this relates to kind of how the industrialization of society has made us so that we can only really do one thing, right? Like if you're in a factory, you only make part of the chair. And I think that by reinserting ourselves into a world where we know a lot of things and we have a lot of perspectives, like if you have a biologist or psychologist in an English class, which, well, Dr. Brew would say that's typically the opinion that I bring. That was a lot of my comments on Oedipus was about biology and psychology. Like you can have so many more interesting interpretations because literature is a form of human expression, and that is not isolated. That is not something that just exists in academic institutions. And so when you say that only people with PhDs, only people in colleges can analyze this stuff, you are stripping the meaning out of human creation. And I think that, hey, maybe give this book to a middle schooler and see what like crazy whack ideas they have. Like everybody has such different eyes, and we do in academic institutions train people to have very similar eyes sometimes. And so it is really valuable to have outsider perspectives, especially outsider perspectives that don't have anything to do with what you're reading.
So well put. I don't think I could say it better. You're going to top that? Go ahead. I'll try.
I'm not going to top that. I'm not going to try to top that. But I will say this was just kind of an incredible opportunity to take this theory that seemed wild when it was first put to us. I mean, I've talked with Dr. Gavri a little bit. That when I first heard this theory, I was not on board. And I jumped onto the team because I thought, sure, I mean, that sounds interesting, and I like this teacher. I think this would be fun. But it was just amazing to be able to run with this and to do the research and to help do the research myself and to read the books together in comparison and to really be able to like feel that connection that Dr. Gavri had put forward. And that it felt like it was able to like come up naturally.
Yes, and I will say, I think in time, I do feel like this is not hyperbole, this is the literary find of the century. This connection between Conrad and Fitzgerald and the revealing of Gatsby's race. In time, when it's accepted, people are like, oh my God, what were we reading all this time? I firmly believe that. Eric, yeah. Thank you, guys. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Appreciate it. Thank you.